So I'm just going to start with some housekeeping. Thank you all for attending and joining. I know I look a little different than Jen Allen, so a brief intro. I am taking over the, well, now we're going to call it Leading the Challenger Sales webinar. I'm Andy Harris. I'm the CEO of Challenger. I'm really excited to be launching our newest edition of our Winning and Leading the Challenger Sales webinar. I've been the CEO at Challenger for the past 2 years, helping us continue the incredible work that the team before me was doing. My background is in SaaS technology as well as consulting services. I was also formerly a CRO, a head of marketing, a CMO. So really have been in the go-to-market space for over 20 years. So I'm really excited to bring some of my expertise and some of my favorite guests to our webinar. So really looking forward to it. So just some few housekeeping things. Today's session is going to be recorded and the recording will be sent out early next week. Please use the Q&A button to submit questions instead of the chat. This way we'll make sure to get all of your questions. Things sometimes get lost in the chat. The last thing is that when you exit the webinar, a survey will pop up where you can share feedback directly with us, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions on what you think we should be covering. So now, without further ado, let's get to the topic at hand. So our December theme is Challenger in Review. So looking back at 2022. So our question for you is, when you're looking back, what are some of the things that you are were most challenging for your organization? Yeah, I see a lot of filling the top of the funnel. That's certainly been something we've been seeing a lot at Challenger as well. People just are not interested in talking to people, especially at the end of the year. Q4 is always challenging. Valuable leads, yeah. Close second is selling from a commercial insight and getting our messages right, which we'll talk about is so important, especially in this new economic downturn. Oh, it looks like losing deals to status quo is starting to, no decision is starting to pop up around 19%. Oh, it's a dead heat between that and selling from a commercial insight. Navigating across large buyer groups for sure. We've got lots of stakeholders these days. All right, so it looks like our final winner, or I don't know if that's a winner these days, but filling the top of funnel with valuable leads, certainly something that's been a challenging to a lot of companies, especially I know marketing firms. I know a lot of people are really putting a lot of pressure on their marketing teams to be like, we need more funnels, we need more top of funnel, we need more leads. So for sure. All right, thanks everyone for participating in that. So I think you guys can share the results. All right, fantastic. So our theme for December is 2022 year in review, like we just talked about. And so we're going to be looking back on some of the best insights from winning the Challenger sale this year. So before Jen takes us through some takeaways from all of her incredible sessions this year, we wanted to just turn it over to really look at, what are the challenges that you guys all face, which we already did. And then, we can continue with playing the recording from Jen.
Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Jen Allen, and we are here, the final episode of season 3 of Winning the Challenger Sale. And first, let me just say to all of you that have joined us every month this year, thank you, thank you, thank you. It has been such a joy learning with you, engaging with you in the questions. And I am so excited for today's episode, which is, as you can see here, a 2022 year in review, where we're going to be looking at our #1 competitor that many of us were stuck fighting against this year, and then breaking down one key takeaway from each of the 10 episodes we've delivered this year. So if you've joined us every month, this will be a great refresher. If you're newer to the series, this will be a great way to decide, hey, do I want to go back and watch the full episode for free on challengerinc.com? We'll throw the link in the chat right now for those of you who don't know how to access the previous replays. But thank you for being with us today, and let's dive right in. So first and foremost, let's talk about the big, ugly competitor that caught many of us on our heels this year, which, as you can see here, is status quo, right? I think if we look back to January, February, many of us were in very different positions than we are now. The market has changed, the circumstances have changed, and kudos to everybody who's been joining us every month to learn new ideas and tactics for how to combat that. But what you see here is essentially what is happening in the minds of so many of our B2B buyers that we're seeking to engage right now, which is, as much as I look at your solution and say, gosh, that's better than what I'm doing now, there's two voices in my head as a buyer that are preventing me from moving forward. One is the rational voice where I'm saying, man, I really like this solution, but budgets are tight. How will it look if I walk into my CFO's office and ask for money after we've just made cuts or done layoffs or talked about cash flow restrictions? On top of that, any budget I do request requires quantifiable impact, which means I now have to take time out of my already busy schedule to build a business case, get consensus for it. That's all extra work, right? On the emotional side, we've got that risk aversion playing out, right? What if I buy something and my team actually preferred the old way of doing it? What if I buy it and it doesn't work the way it said it would? What if I buy it and it takes a lot longer for the team to get trained on how to use it? So ultimately what happens is our buyers are walking themselves back and saying, hey, I know what you have is better, but good is good enough. And as a result, what we're seeing is that many of our pipelines are being really destroyed by this no decision or status quo competitor. Now, when we studied this a couple of years ago, the number we came out with was an average of 38% of all opportunities ending in no decision or status quo, which is essentially the customer saying, hey, good is good enough. When I talk about this with organizations, more often I'm hearing numbers that sound more like 60%, 70%, right? So regardless of what the exact number is for you, it's hard to deny that in many cases, our biggest competitor is actually the customer's unwillingness to move off of status quo. And so one thing I encouraged folks to do earlier in the series is sit down and look at your own pipeline and figure out how much are you actually losing to this competitor, and how many hours a month are you seeing wasted on deals that don't buy from your competitor, don't do something else, they just stick with what they're currently doing. And so ultimately, one of the big themes from the series this year was focused on how do we create a cost of inaction? How do we show customers that the costs of what they're currently doing far outweigh all of these fears and risks they perceive as it relates to the pains of buying and implementing your solution. So as many of you know, this is one of my all-time favorite things. One of our customers actually came up with this, which is our job as sellers is to present a case such that the pain of what they're currently doing, the cost of inaction is far greater than all of their fears and costs and things associated with actually buying and implementing the solution or the pains of change. So just a quick recap on status quo, that ugly competitor that has been beating many of us up, myself included, this year. Now, let's get into a breakdown of episode by episode for all 10 episodes this year. What's one key takeaway we learned, and sharing that so that if you want to go back, refresh yourself on those concepts, you have an idea of where to spend your time. So if we go all the way back to February, the topic for February was engaging C-level buyers. And the big key takeaway here was the conventional wisdom around get to the C-level, get to the decision maker, in many ways is evolving. And in fact, what we've uncovered is that there's 3 different purchase cultures that exist in companies today. So on the left, you've got the traditional sort of top-down, get to the decision maker, they make decisions at the top and push it down. Still exists. But what we start to see shifting is there's more of what you see in the center, which is more of an open dialogue, where I may not have the senior most title, but I may have intimacy with a problem, and I may take that problem and start to circulate it around different roles and functions within the business. And so what we see is it's less of a top down and more of a bouncing all around, which encourages sellers to think differently about the way we approach multi-threading, right? And ensuring that we are gaining multiple different perspectives on the problem at hand. And then the last one, which we call Groundswell, has really evolved into sort of this product-led growth motion, where we're actually looking at what folks on the front line are doing and using, and that's informing some of the purchase decisions that we're making. So key takeaway here is don't assume that all of your accounts buy in a top-down motion. Spend your time in the call to understand how they've made decisions in the past so you can isolate which one of these three categories they most relate to. Now, in March, we delved into one of my favorite topics, hate the title, social selling, because we're not really social selling as much as we are social teaching. But the big key takeaway here is teaching where our customers go to learn. Now, I have talked about this data probably so many times that you're sick of hearing it, but it truly has transformed the way I view my role as a seller. And essentially what this told us is when we look at how B2B buying groups spend their time, 83% of the time they are spending making decisions is actually without us sellers. And if you look at that 17% slide or size, that's all suppliers. So if we operate on the rule of three, at best I'm getting what, maybe 5-6% of that buying group's time that they're evaluating different purchases and decisions. And so in this episode, we dove really deep into how do we show up in the places where our customers go to learn? How do we show up not selling our solutions, but adding insightful questions and perspective on the problem such that it draws buyers and prospects in to want to learn more. So we got really tactical in this episode. Everything from how do you set up your social profile? How do you construct a post that isn't, all about your solution or your company, and tips and tricks to keep in mind as you start engaging in social media. Then episode 3, we moved into another topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is email pitfalls to avoid. And our key takeaway here is there's been a lot of talk over the past few years around personalization and relevance. Our advice here is don't force personalization. If you see someone went to Penn State like me, not everybody is a Nittany Lion fan for life, myself included. When we try to force it based on these really generic things, sometimes we really miss the mark. So what we encourage in this episode is to instead focus on relevance, right? And what we did in this episode is we broke down frameworks for emails. What we've shown here on the screen is one that we kind of refer to as scaled relevance. This is not something you could only send to one particular account. We also offered a framework on one if you're selling to a list of target accounts or enterprise accounts that is highly focused on one account. But we shared a few different examples to give you different frameworks so that you don't show up with emails that are riddled with I and we and immediately trigger that sort of mental spam filter that the folks at Lavender talk a lot about that results in our prospects hitting that delete button. So again, very tactical episode where we're breaking down repeatable frameworks that you can use to be highly relevant, to get the right tonality without leading with, I know more than you do about your business, or here's why we're the #1 leading supplier. Now, episode 4 is probably the least sexy topic in the whole series. Nobody wakes up in the morning and gets hot and bothered over opportunity prioritization, but we should, right? Because when you look at high performers, one of the things they are absolutely ruthless about is how they spend their time. And so when we all come into January and we're handed a territory, we have decisions to make around who we spend our time targeting, where we double down, and where we deprioritize. And so in this episode, our big takeaway here was don't be too overly dependent on sort of demographics about the account. So what I mean by that are things like employee size, revenue size, the sexiness of the brand, right? I certainly was guilty in the past of prioritizing accounts that had really large sales teams and really sexy names because I thought, man, how cool would it be to win those? But what we advised in this episode is to use a process that we call reframe potential. Reframe potential is essentially looking at what are you reframing your prospects in terms of their own, assumptions and biases about how they approach problems today, and to what extent in different companies are they actually facing that problem. So here you'll see a sort of snippet from the episode where we give 4 questions to assess the reframe potential of a particular account. To bring it to life, if I was selling, Challenger to Zoom during the pandemic, and I went through these 4 questions, chances are they probably have a low level of reframe potential, right? Their phones were ringing off the hook. They had more demand than they could keep up with. So just because they are a big, sexy account does not mean that I, as a seller, should have prioritized them back in COVID, right? So it's things like that that give us a different lens to look through for how we make decisions about which accounts we prioritize and which we deprioritize. Now, getting into my boy Muggsy. Those of you that joined us for persuasive storytelling will remember the story that I told here. Those of you that had not, essentially what we talked about is how cost of inaction is making it so difficult for us sellers to compel buyers to see the urgency and change. And if you're like me, historically, I traditionally relied on a lot of facts and figures and data and benchmarks. It was very rationally driven when I was speaking with my buyers. But as a result, in many cases, I was quite forgettable, right? I would have what I thought was a good conversation, but then the second conversation wouldn't occur. And so when I reflected on it, what I realized is there's an emotional and a rational side to how we compel people to change, right? And the story I told about my dog Muggsy was about how our kids would always leave their bath towels on the floor. And I tried to convince them to change by telling them all the benefits of hanging up their towel. Things like you won't have to wash it so frequently. Don't know what I was thinking with that. They don't do laundry. It won't stink as much. They're 8 and 10. They don't care how their towel smells. It won't be so damp. It's not that damp to them, right? So I was trying to compel them to change by talking about the benefits of hanging up their towel. My boy here is 10 years old. He is still not housebroken. He wears a diaper at this point. But prior to putting him in a diaper, what I realized is when Muggsy came in and peed on one of the kids' bath towels, that was the ultimate driver of behavior change, right? Now, because all of a sudden there was a negative consequence with inaction, a negative consequence with leaving the towel on the floor. So I am not advocating that you go tell stories to your prospects about your dogs peeing on your kids' towels, but it is a good example of how sometimes we neglect to use storytelling to really convey the consequences of inaction. So we break down frameworks for how you tell stories, and most importantly, how you make sure that your customer is the hero of the story, not your solution, not your company. So this is a really fun episode. Next, for those of you that read The Challenger Customer or have heard about The Challenger Customer, which is the second book in the Challenger series, this is where we break into the whole world of mobilizers, talkers, and blockers, which very quickly, what we learned when we studied stakeholders, similarly to how we studied sellers, is there's 3 different types of buyers. It has nothing to do with their title, their tenure, their seniority, and everything to do with the way that they respond to your Challenger message or Challenger insight. And so in this episode, we help you understand how do you find mobilizers? What do you do if you're stuck kind of with a talker or a blocker? And then most importantly, when you do find your mobilizer, how do you work with them to help the buying group align on the problem, not yet the solution? So what you see here is a snippet of 3 recommendations for what you do once you've got a great mobilizer that you're working with. So those are making sure that you're articulating the cost of inaction in the language of the business, working with your mobilizer to refine that, making sure that prior to stepping into a group meeting, you're going beyond just their titles, their familiarity with you as a solution, and getting deeper into things like, who might be our Mr. Rogers, the person that shows up to every call, just nods their head, you think you've won them over, and then they hang up, and they're just nice people. They're not actually advocating for you. Or who is most likely to be pro status quo and why? So you understand the history of why people might be wedded to current state. And then lastly, again, before walking into these calls, understanding the dynamics of the group, right? Anybody that sells to sales and marketing knows that in some cases, it's a lot like a divorced couple, right? Anybody who's selling to teams where you've got different power struggles, may walk into these circumstances and read that the buyers are disagreeing with you, when in reality, it actually has much more to do with the history of their interpersonal relationships. So working with your buyers to understand these things prior to stepping into a group meeting so you can manage those dynamics effectively. Next, we get into what might be my favorite episode of the series. This one's near and dear to my heart, which is what we called resolving buying group conflict. Our key takeaway here was our roles as sellers selling into consensus decision-making buying groups has to shift. If we show up to these group meetings and we are just pitching and showing up and throwing up our solution and trying to win people over on the idea of buying from us, we will fall short because buying groups are dysfunctional. There's massive disagreement often on the problem we're even trying to solve, let alone the solution or the supplier we go with. So this is another episode we get really, really tactical, breaking down how do I set up the meeting? How do I run the meeting? How do I close the meeting? How do I work with my mobilizer to make sure I'm prepared going into this? And this is a snippet from how we open the meeting, right? So we share that cost of an action statement. We encourage disagreement, right? Instead of seeking agreement, which many of us were trained to do, we want to openly seek disagreement out from participants, because 9 times out of 10, it's there. And in doing so, we have to hold back on trying to overcome objections and rather prompt different parties within the buying group to respond to one another. And lastly, and this one is so important right now, acknowledging that there are other priorities beyond the one that we're discussing right now and getting the group to norm about those. So some advice on language and things to do in those situations. So again, one of my favorite episodes is most of us now are up against buying groups who are highly, highly dysfunctional. Now, as we get later stage, Driving Urgency for Change is where we welcomed Matt Dixon, who is co-author of The Challenger Sale, The Challenger Customer, Effortless Experience, and the newest book, The Jolt Effect, where he shared with us his findings around what happens later stage that is driving status quo behaviors from our buyers. So at early stage, we're talking about how do we overcome the cost of an action? How do we overcome that, pain of same? Later stage, now we have to think about how do we overcome indecision? And he introduced a term which I absolutely love, which is FOMO. We've all heard of FOMO, fear of missing out. FOMO is fear of messing up. So he walked us through the 4 tenets of the JOLT philosophy, where we break down what we as sellers can do to minimize the fear of purchasing. So a great episode. If you haven't yet read JOLT, this is kind of like a Cliff Notes version of the book, will definitely entice you to learn more. Episode 9, I invited 2 of our great colleagues here at Challenger, VP of Account Management, Dan Flood, VP of Sales, Alex Schrager, to break down, this is a bit of a different approach for us, how AMs and AEs use mutual close plans differently to reduce final mile surprises. So you'll see here, we talked about some pitfalls that are very common when we're trying to kind of move those customers along late stage, and how mutual close plans can help us reduce some of those surprises. So we shared an example of a template. Alex talked about what we do in AE circumstances where a lot of the times we have a lot of unknowns. Dan talked about in AM circumstances, how we can pull forward some of these conversations much earlier than we might think. A fabulous episode for anybody like me who hasn't been religiously using mutual close plans. It certainly got me thinking differently about it. And last but not least, last month, we hit on the topic of preparing for negotiations. And the big word that we learned together was Torschlusspanik. It is a German phrase that means gate close panic. So anybody who has ever rushed to get to a gate on time and been worried you're going to miss it, we have that same feeling in the pit of our stomachs when we've worked really hard to build an opportunity and build a deal. And then we get to negotiations and we feel like we've got to do all of these things to save it. And we make stupid decisions sometimes, at least I certainly have in my career. And so in this episode, we welcomed our SVP of Sales, Adam Maud, to take us through some really practical advice on how do I prepare going into a negotiation call. What you see here on the screen was one of my favorite takeaways from the episode, which is the idea of building a really buyer-focused concession strategy for negotiations. And what we mean by that is not just jumping to a discount or jumping to certain invoicing terms, but thinking about it from the context of the buyer and is making some judgment calls around what type of value drivers may come into play for negotiations that prevent us from having to fall back on discounts. So this was a really phenomenal episode. Adam gave some really amazing tactical advice. So that's a whole year in like 20 minutes. And now, as I mentioned before, we'll throw the link in the chat. If you've missed any of these episodes, you can access any of them for free on challengerinc.com. You can see the entire episode. I highly encourage you to go back and spend some time on the topics that you feel like maybe you want to develop a little bit more. But before I hand it back to Andy Harris, our CEO, for a really special announcement, I want to say, last but not least, a huge, huge thank you. This year has been one of the biggest joys of my professional career. 1,607 of you have joined us each month to learn how we take the theory of Challenger and break it down into the jobs to be done that we have as sellers. So I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. I wish everybody the most amazing close to your Q4. Thank you for the time you spent with us this year. And now back to Andy.
Thank you. Thanks. Big thanks to Jen for that awesome recap. This was definitely a year for the books. So many highlights I think about when I look at everything we've talked about this year. And, you know, of course, FOMU from Matt Dixon was amazing. I'm so excited as we continue our relationship with Matt Dixon and Jolt into 2023 around No Decision. Definitely one of my favorite episodes. And of course, you know, as Jen knows, anytime Muggsy can come over and teach my teenagers how to not leave their wet towel on the floor, I am all for that. So I will need to train my dog differently to help them feel that pain of inaction. So thanks again, Jen. It was awesome. Really, really appreciate that recap. And make sure, if you, like Jen said, if you haven't had a chance to go back and listen to some of those episodes, I mean, they're really just dynamic, especially some of the ones that she mentioned. So a huge thanks to all of our special guests this year and for Jen for bringing that all to us. So as Jen mentioned, we do have an announcement that's about our next webinar series. And I kind of alluded to this, but starting in February of 2023, we will be launching Leading the Challenger Sales. So very similar to Winning the Challenger Sales, but we also are going to be featuring CEOs and CROs, as well as sales managers, leaders, enablement professionals, RevOps leaders. All of this is how do we build a high performance sales community. We spent a lot of time in 2022 talking about the individual seller and tips and tools for the individual seller and the sales managers. And now we're going to kind of take it up a level. So we will meet on the second Thursday of each month for these sessions. Also, our Winning the Challenger podcast is available on all major podcast providers. If you're not already a listener, we'll continue to share practical advice on how we show up like a challenger in your customer conversations. We will be releasing 2 new podcasts monthly, once again, starting in February of 2023. Also, if there are any topics you'd like to see covered next year, be sure to fill out the survey. So that survey that I mentioned, when you leave the webinar, it will pop up. Please answer those questions. Let me know what you want to hear from, and we'll certainly be making sure that we cover those topics. So before we jump into Q&A, I do want to circle back to those polling questions. We asked you before, what was the biggest concern you had in Challenge in 2022? Now we want to know what you are thinking about. What are you anticipating the impact, for 2023? Thinking ahead for 2023, what do you think is going to be impacting your organization the most? And as usual, filling the top of funnel is still the head here right now. But let's see what else I'm hearing. I'm looking and I'm seeing losing decisions to status quo or no decision. So that pain of the same versus the pain of the change, which is so impactful when you start thinking about that decision process. So still getting some intel here. So still for the top of funnel. So, episode 2 around the social selling is a big piece for that one. Persuasive storytelling all helps around filling that top of the funnel. The navigating large buyer group. So Jen talked about the different types of deals, right? The top-down decision makers versus kind of the open discussion, open dialogue versus kind of the groundswell approach. Selling from a company insight and commercial insight. Yeah, absolutely. So once again, it looks like our top one on this was filling the top of the funnel with valuable leads, lots of options for our marketing team, and then losing deals to status quo. So thank you all for helping to shape what people are thinking about. It's really helpful for us to understand, but also I'm sure you all can appreciate that it's really nice to see people are probably in the same boat that you're in as they're thinking about anticipating 2023. So now I want to turn it over for some Q&A. So I think there were a few questions that came in.
Yeah. Hi, Andy. It's been blowing up with questions. So really excited to get some of these over to you. So one of the first ones is looking ahead to 23, what do you think are the most important skills that sellers need to have or that sales managers need to coach their teams on, especially as we're looking at this current economic environment? I know you spoke to this a little bit, but that was definitely one of the hot questions that came in right at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that you can do. I mean, one, I think if you look at the opportunity cost, I mean, Jen gave the example of Zoom, right? Trying to sell to a company that we all think during economic times, let's go sell to the company that's already doing well. But potentially they might not need our solution as much, or there might not be as much of a burning platform. So really understanding who is a company that can really benefit from our solution. And if you think about Challenger, it was written during the recession, right? So this whole idea of how do you sell and how do you continue to be successful during a downturn, during an downturn in an economy? And a lot of that is really pushing that if you stay the same, right, that cost of inaction and making sure that you're really thinking about what happens if you do nothing and really helping them understand. And this is where persuasive storytelling comes in as well, really helping them understand, here's an example of if you don't change and you don't do what you need to do, it's going to be worse for you. So really helping them drive that inaction and making them really do something. I think the other piece around that is really, and we'll talk about this in some of our, when Matt Dixon comes on and we talk about Jolt, but also that fear of messing up, that fear of just not pushing the stage forward, just really making sure you're using your mobilizer, your stakeholders, really all the people that can help you with all this buyer dysfunction. So really making sure if there is somebody who can be a mobilizer, making sure you're using them to help drive that urgency.
That's awesome, Andy. You mentioned persuasive storytelling. There was actually another question that came in. What would you recommend will be a good practice to make sure that we can get a second meeting and create the awareness with the customer that inactions will also impact them? So this question was related to episode 5, which obviously was about persuasive storytelling. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and I think, often as sellers, we want to talk about the benefits, the features, the functionality of our product. We get really excited about, all the things that will be better. So it's additive, right? We're really thinking about all the good. And I think in this economy, it's a little bit more of that emotional scare tactic, which once again, we're not there to scare our customers, but really making them understand what will happen if they don't do something, and really thinking about, what happens if you don't tell them a story about a similar client or a customer that's going through a similar issue that they might be doing, and what happened when they didn't do something. So I think we really need to focus on that, as well as making sure that we are telling them good stories. And lastly, I'll go back to two topics that we've talked about in previous episodes. One, that mobilizer, making sure you understand the different buyers and what are their motives and what are the different stakeholders for all the different buyers, what's most important to them and what's going to really cause the pain for them. So for example, a CFO who's now, procurement is now pretty much a permanent fixture in our buying process. What is that pain for that CFO or that procurement person? Because that's going to be different than the pain of inactivity for a business user or someone who wants the product. So really, once again, understanding all the different pains for all the different stakeholders, and then using your mobilizers and stories to help get across why it's so important that you continue to make that change.
That's great. We've had a bunch of conversation in the chat about Jolt, which I know everyone's super excited about. And one of the things that we mentioned here and talk about is the partnership that we've got. What are we offering, or what what is Challenger offering in terms of opportunities for these folks to get involved with Matt Dixon? I think specifically this was about some of the SKO offerings.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're so excited that we launched our partnership with Matt Dixon, and he will definitely be on our webinar series this year. But really, what we're trying to do, if you imagine Challenger Sale, right? The idea of the first book was kind of, if you imagine, was part one, right? You need all this foundations. It's like building a house. You need that foundation. And then Joel, Matt's second book, or I guess fourth book, if you count the Challenger books, is but his newest book is really about, once you have a lot of that foundations, how do you kind of take it to the next level, especially around no decision. So his book is really focused on that no decision. We are offering training on Jolt, as well as we do have keynotes available around Jolt in the new book for the sales kickoff. So we will have workshops, training, e-learning, a lot to go along with the Jolt product. So really, really excited about that opportunity.
That's great. And I
And
know,
please reach out, through Challenger, or, directly in the chat, feel free to send us your email, and we'll make sure that we set you up with some information on that.
yeah, I was just going to say, I can see the link was thrown in the chat as well for anybody who's interested in that. Another question, a bit of a different conversation, but with budgets, tightening, how can we make a strong business case and protect our sales training programs from getting cut?
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing. I think the immediate knee-jerk reaction, right? And I'm a CEO, so I'm feeling it too, right? It's like, okay, well, do we want to spend money on this? Do we want to kind of save our money because we're not sure what's happening with the economy? So we're all tightening our belts, a little bit of keeping some cash and just making sure in case, because there's so much uncertainty in the market right now. So I think what's really important to understand is to go back to that concept that your sales people need more training more than ever now during tough economic times. Going back to the fact that the Challenger sale was produced during the recession. And part of that was because when times are good, you don't necessarily, everybody can sell, ice to Eskimos, right? When times are good, it's easy to sell. Even if you're a relationship seller, even if you're more of a lone wolf seller, you can typically get away with it. So, a good economy and, good revenue, kind of makes up for some of those mistakes that your sellers make. However, when times are really tight, that's when your true, really good Challenger sellers, that's when they shine. This is their time to shine. And this is where they really are going to outperform. So more importantly than ever, it's that they have the right skills and the right training. Because imagine, look at buyer dysfunction, right? We now know that you go through about 12 to 18 different potential buyers in a very complex sale. You need to figure out how to navigate every single one of them. If you've never done that before, that's going to be really challenging, really cumbersome, and really overwhelming. So having that coaching and that training is really important.
Awesome. And I think our last question to round us out, unless anybody else wants to include another QA. Oh, wait, maybe we just got to, no, that was a thank you. So our last question to round us out, any sneak peeks into Challenger's roadmap for next year? Anything you can share as an exclusive to our webinar attendees?
Oh, I like that. I like where that question's going. Yes, I am super excited. We have some awesome things. We talked about Jolt, which is something that we're super excited to launch in January. So that is definitely one of our biggest products. The other two other products that I'm really excited about is our Loop product, which is our win-loss data analysis product. And what's so great about our Loop product is, unlike a lot of other win-loss analysis products, it's while a deal is in flight. So we talked about going after the wrong opportunities or the wrong buyers. This is just an easier way to figure out if they're just not that into you, right? So what it does is it allows you to do a quick survey after an initial discovery call or mid-flight deal and know how serious is this buyer, or are they just not having a great sales experience? So we're really measuring the sales experience versus why did you win or why did you lose, but what is going on currently in the moment with that sales experience. And what that allows you to do is either say, hey, this person isn't having a great sales experience. We need to get somebody else on this, on this deal, or do more of a team selling approach. Or B, maybe they're just not ready to buy, or we're not giving them the right information. We're not using the right commercial insights with them to help them create that value proposition. So really, understanding your buyer earlier in the process, because most of us deal with pretty elongated sales processes. We know they can take 6 to 8 months. So, you don't want to find out 8 months later that you didn't deliver a great sales experience. Wouldn't you rather know that in, month 1? So that is the product that I am, beyond excited for. So that's our Loop product. And then the last thing I'll say is we are really working on integrations within our working with our sales enablement companies. So we have integrations, for example, with HighSpot, Showpad. So really being able to take our challenger information and integrate that in where your users already are. So being able to like have only log in once. So really a lot of those integrations between LMS systems. So if I'm already in my main learning development system, I can now bring Challenger into that versus having to log on to a whole separate Challenger e-learning platform. So a lot around tech advances and really thinking about all the different parts of that customer journey.
Awesome. I think that that gets all our QA out of the way.
Perfect. Well, I think we've reached the end of our time. So thank you all for joining us today. And in all of our webinars this year, for all of you, the 1,600 plus that attended all of our webinars this year, we're really looking forward to you joining us next year for leading the Challenger Sales webinar series. So definitely look for more information in the coming few weeks around that. Also just want to wish everyone happy holidays, happy new year. Such an incredible time to spend time with family and friends. So thanks again for joining us and looking forward to an amazing 2023. Hope everybody hits their numbers for those of you who Q4 is the end of your year. Thank you again.